A whisper in the dark, or the sound of guilt. Welcome to Marsh Shadow Files. I am your host, Lucian. This community is growing fast. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Your words keep this mystery alive. Let's begin. The Pembroke Theatre possessed the particular stillness that settles upon a stage after the final curtain call, when the last echo of applause has faded and only shadows remain to witness the evening's conclusion. Dust motes danced in the amber light that filtered down from the upper galleries, catching upon the carved cherubs and gilded cornices that had presided over countless performances since Victoria's reign. The red velvet seats, now largely empty, seemed to retain the warmth of their recent occupants, while the air itself held that distinctive theatrical fragrance of old upholstery, faded flowers, and the lingering ghost of good tobacco. Inspector Roderick Allain made his way through the theatre's ornate corridors with the quiet authority of one accustomed to arriving where tragedy had preceded him. The curved staircase leading to the private boxes bore the patina of decades, its brass handrail worn smooth by countless gloved hands. He paused briefly before a dark-glazed portrait of some long-forgotten actor-manager whose painted eyes seemed to regard the evening's unexpected drama with professional interest. Two constables waited in the upper corridor, their presence tactfully unobtrusive yet unmistakably official. Beside them stood a man whose evening dress, though impeccably cut, could not entirely conceal the nervous energy that animated his every gesture. Charles Pemberton, the theatre's manager, possessed the anxious elegance of one whose livelihood depended upon maintaining appearances even in the face of catastrophe. "Inspector Allen." Pemberton's voice carried the trained projection of a man accustomed to addressing audiences. "I do apologize for the circumstances. We've had what I can only describe as a most unfortunate incident during our literary symposium." A woman emerged from the shadows of the corridor, her bearing suggesting both academic authority and carefully maintained composure. Professor Miranda Blackwood wore her silver hair arranged with mathematical precision, and her burgundy evening dress spoke of someone who understood that in scholarly circles, as in the theatre, presentation mattered as much as substance. Her hands, Allain noted, trembled almost imperceptibly as she clutched a symposium program. "Dr. Vivian Ashworth collapsed during our dramatic reading," she explained, her voice carrying the measured cadence of a seasoned lecturer. "He was in the Pemberton box when it occurred. Our house physician has pronounced it a heart attack, but—" The slight hesitation in her words suggested complexities that mere medical diagnosis could not encompass. Allain entered the private box with the careful attention he brought to all scenes of sudden death. The intimate space, with its faded silk and gilt appointments, seemed almost domestic in its proportions. Dr. Ashworth lay slumped in a chair whose tufted buttons had left small impressions in the flesh below his ear. His face, which had presumably once possessed a certain scholarly handsomeness, now bore the slack expression of unexpected departure. The theatre's physician, Dr. Pettigrew, stood at a respectful distance, his professional composure slightly strained by the evening's events. "I'm afraid there was nothing to be done, Inspector. The heart gave way quite suddenly. Not uncommon at his age, particularly given the excitement of an academic presentation." Allain's gaze fell upon the small table beside the deceased, where a cut-glass decanter and balloon snifter had been arranged with theatrical precision. The brandy glass was not quite empty, its contents catching the light in a way that suggested more than mere alcohol. When he tilted it slightly, the residue moved with a sluggish reluctance that spoke to his trained observation. "Who brought the refreshment?" he inquired with characteristic courtesy. Mrs. Reeves, the box keeper, appeared at the threshold with the deferential manner of one who had spent decades serving the theatre's patrons. Her lace collar and carefully arranged hair spoke of old-fashioned propriety, while her distress seemed genuine and unaffected. "Dr. Ashworth rang for his usual brandy, sir. Always did, just as the reading reached its climax. Said it helped him appreciate the dramatic moment." A young man had been standing in the shadows, unnoticed until Professor Blackwood drew him forward with a gesture that combined introduction and protection. Timothy Hartwell clutched a battered leather portfolio against his chest like a talisman, his scholarly pallor made more pronounced by the theater's dramatic lighting. His devotion to his mentor appeared absolute, yet something in his manner suggested depths that mere academic loyalty could not explain. Mr. Hartwell was Dr. Ashworth's research assistant, Professor Blackwood explained. He was to have helped receive our guests after the reading. Dame Cordelia Fairfax descended from the stage with the measured grace of one who had commanded audiences for decades. Her theatrical presence remained intact despite the evening's disruption, though Alan detected a carefully controlled tension in her movements. She had changed from her performance costume into an elegant black dress that seemed almost too perfectly appropriate for the circumstances. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying the trained resonance of the classical stage, "I fear my performance may have masked the poor gentleman's distress." When he cried out, we assumed it was appreciation for the dramatic revelation. The small group fell silent, and in that silence Alain sensed the complex undercurrents that inevitably accompanied sudden death in closed communities. The scholarly world, like the theater, itself operated according to elaborate codes of behavior and carefully maintained hierarchies. Beneath the evening's tragic surface, he suspected, lay deeper currents of ambition, rivalry, and perhaps secrets that would require considerable delicacy to navigate. As the formalities proceeded, Alan found his attention drawn repeatedly to the brandy glass and its suspicious contents. On the program that lay beneath Dr. Ashworth's hand, a pencil had scored a vertical mark beside the words, "Act 3, The Discovery." Whether this meant nothing or everything remained to be determined, but in Alain's experience, such details rarely proved entirely coincidental. The theater, with its accumulated memories of countless performances, seemed to hold its breath as the evening's real drama began to unfold. The green room of the Pembroke Theatre possessed that particular quality of faded grandeur common to spaces where performers had gathered for decades to shed their public masks. Gilt mirrors, their surfaces dimmed by time and the breath of countless conversations, reflected the amber glow of converted gas fixtures that cast theatrical shadows across worn Persian carpets and leather chairs polished smooth by years of anxious occupation. The air held layers of scent, old velvet, face powder, and the lingering ghost of expensive tobacco, creating an atmosphere that seemed to encourage confidences while simultaneously preserving secrets. Inspector Allen positioned himself near the marble mantelpiece, where a small fire provided both warmth and the sort of domestic comfort that might encourage unguarded moments. He had arranged for tea to be served, understanding that the ritual of pouring and stirring often proved more effective than direct interrogation in loosening carefully guarded tongues. The china bore the theater's monogram in faded gold, and the gentle percussion of spoons against porcelain provided a civilized counterpoint to the evening's darker business. Dame Cordelia Fairfax occupied the room's most commanding chair, with the unconscious authority of one who had held audiences captive for 4 decades. Her transformation from the grieving Harriet Vane she had portrayed on stage to her natural self revealed the subtle artistry that distinguished great performers from mere actors. She accepted her teacup with hands that showed only the faintest tremor, though whether from age or the evening's shock remained diplomatically unclear. Dr. Ashworth was preparing what he termed his definitive reassessment of current Dorothy L. Sayre scholarship, she explained, her trained voice carrying the precise diction that made even casual conversation sound like carefully rehearsed dialogue. He had mentioned to several of us that his findings would necessitate significant revisions to established academic opinion, rather dramatic language, even for Vivian. Professor Miranda Blackwood, who had positioned herself near the room's writing desk with the territorial instinct of an academic claiming intellectual space, set down her teacup with mathematical precision. Her silver hair caught the lamplight as she arranged her symposium materials in patterns that spoke to deeper needs for control and order. Vivian was always rather theatrical in his pronouncements, she observed, her voice carrying the careful modulation of one navigating professional rivalries that extended far beyond mere scholarly disagreement. One learned to take his academic revelations with appropriate skepticism, though his research was invariably thorough. The door opened to admit Dr. Helena Voss and James Whitmore, their entrance accompanied by the particular tension of younger scholars navigating established hierarchies. Dr. Voss wore her evening dress with the careful attention of one perpetually aware of being observed and judged, while Whitmore carried himself with the diffident manner of a junior colleague uncertain of his welcome among distinguished company. "Inspector," Dr. Voss offered, accepting tea with hands that betrayed slight nervousness, "we are naturally appalled by this tragedy. If there is anything we might contribute to your understanding of the evening's events." Elaine noted the careful phrasing, the academic's instinct to qualify and hedge even in moments of apparent cooperation. "I understand Dr. Ashworth had been particularly interested in questions of scholarly collaboration," he said gently. "Perhaps you could illuminate his specific concerns." A silence fell that carried weight beyond mere conversational pause. Dame Cordelia's eyebrows rose with theatrical subtlety, while Professor Blackwood's fingers stilled on her papers. James Whitmore glanced at Dr. Voss with a sort of quick, nervous look that suggested shared secrets extending beyond professional collaboration. Dr. Ashworth believed that certain works attributed to individual authors might have involved more extensive assistance than previously acknowledged, Dr. Voss finally replied, her words chosen with the particular care of one walking through a minefield of academic reputation. He was quite passionate about questions of intellectual integrity, and potentially devastating for certain scholarly careers, I should imagine, Dame Cordelia murmured, her tone suggesting layers of meaning that academic politeness prevented from being stated directly. Mrs. Endicott appeared at the threshold with the quiet efficiency of one accustomed to moving invisibly through important spaces. Her practical dress and sensible shoes marked her as distinctly separate from the academic company, yet her manner suggested the sort of observational skills that came from decades of managing theatrical personalities and their various crises. "Begging your pardon, Inspector," she said, her voice carrying the respectful deference of theatrical hierarchy. "But I thought you should know that during the performance I observed someone entering the Pemberton box. The lighting was rather dim for the dramatic effect, and I couldn't make out who it might have been, but they were wearing academic dress." The room fell silent with the particular stillness that accompanies revelations capable of transforming tragedy into something far more sinister. Elaine observed how each person present seemed to calculate their own movements during the evening's performance, while simultaneously studying their colleagues for signs of particular anxiety or guilt. "How very interesting," Dame Cordelia said, though her tone suggested that interesting was perhaps inadequate for such a development. She set down her teacup with the precise control of a performer managing a crucial prop. Professor Blackwood's composure showed the first signs of strain as she rearranged her papers with unnecessary attention to detail. "Academic dress is hardly uncommon at a symposium, Mrs. Endicott." Half the attendees were similarly attired. "Indeed, madam," the costume mistress replied with quiet dignity. But not half the attendees had reason to visit Dr. Ashworth's box during the performance. Elaine allowed the implications to settle like dust after a stage curtain falls. The academic world, he reflected, operated according to codes as rigid and potentially destructive as any theatrical company, with reputations built over decades capable of destruction through a single, well-documented revelation. The fire crackled softly in the growing silence, and he found himself studying the interplay of shadows on the gilt mirrors, each reflection seeming to hold secrets that daylight might reveal. On the writing desk, partially concealed beneath Professor Blackwood's carefully arranged papers, he glimpsed the corner of a typescript bearing the heading, "The Fetish of Integrity, a Reconsideration." The academic world's capacity for both creation and destruction, he mused, rivaled anything the theatre had ever produced. Somewhere among these cultured voices and careful phrases lay the truth about Dr. Ashworth's death, and he suspected that when revealed, it would prove as dramatically satisfying as any denouement the Pembroke Theatre had ever witnessed. The mirrors continued their silent observation, reflecting not merely the physical appearances of those present, but somehow capturing the carefully constructed facades of their professional lives. In the theatre's accumulated wisdom, truth and performance had always been intimate companions, and tonight that ancient partnership would be tested once again. The stage manager's domain occupied a cramped warren beneath the Pembroke's main staircase, where decades of theatrical history had accumulated in layers as distinct as geological strata. Prompt books dating to the theatre's earliest productions lined shelves that sagged under their accumulated weight, while costume sketches and yellowed programs created a papery archaeology of forgotten performances. The air held that particular backstage fragrance of size and the old paint, dust and dreams that seemed to permeate the very walls of venerable theaters. A single electric bulb cast harsh shadows across Robert Crane's meticulously maintained desk, where production charts and cue sheets bore witness to the complex choreography required to transform literature into living performance. Inspector Allen navigated the narrow space with diplomatic care, noting how every surface served multiple purposes in the economical way of theatrical spaces. Crane himself embodied the particular tension of a man whose professional life depended upon absolute precision, yet who found himself confronting circumstances that defied all scheduling. His wire-rimmed spectacles required constant adjustment, a nervous habit that seemed to intensify whenever the conversation touched upon the evening's unscripted tragedy. "Dr. Ashworth was quite specific about his requirements, Inspector," Crane explained, his voice carrying the measured cadence of one accustomed to managing temperamental personalities. Brandy in the Pemberton box served precisely as the dramatic reading reached Act 3. He claimed it enhanced his appreciation of the climactic moments, rather theatrical for an academic, though I suppose scholars and actors share certain temperamental similarities. The forensic photographer's preliminary report lay open in Alain's hands, its clinical language providing stark counterpoint to the office's theatrical atmosphere. The analysis confirmed what his trained observation had suspected: digitalis in sufficient concentration to ensure rapid cardiac arrest, administered with a precision that spoke to considerable knowledge of both the poison's properties and the victim's habits. The irony was not lost upon him that such a poison, with its literary associations and historical precedent, should be chosen for a Dorothy L. Sayers scholar. Mrs. Endicott appeared in the doorway with the quiet efficiency that marked all her movements through the theater's labyrinthine passages. Her practical dress and carefully arranged gray hair suggested decades of managing the complex requirements of theatrical production, while her manner indicated the sort of observational skills that came from years of anticipating problems before they materialized into crises. "Inspector, if I might expand upon my earlier observation," she said, her voice carrying the respectful deference appropriate to one who understood hierarchies while maintaining professional dignity. It wasn't merely academic dress I observed entering the Pemberton box. The gown bore a particular hood, the sort worn by those with advanced degrees. The movement was studied, purposeful, as if the person belonged there yet wished to avoid notice. The theatrical lighting prevented clearer identification, but the bearing suggested someone of considerable academic standing. Professor Blackwood entered the cramped office with the territorial confidence of one accustomed to commanding academic spaces, though the confined quarters forced her to modify her usual authoritative bearing. She carried a leather portfolio that matched her carefully coordinated ensemble, and her silver hair remained perfectly arranged despite the evening's disruptions. Yet Alan detected subtle signs of strain in her composed facade, a slight tremor in her hands as she arranged her papers, a careful modulation in her voice that suggested words being chosen with particular precision. "Inspector, I felt I should clarify the financial arrangements surrounding our symposium," she began, her academic training evident in the diplomatic phrasing that softened potentially damaging admissions. Dr. Ashworth's presentation was to be the centerpiece of our funding applications to several major foundations. His revelations might have complicated those relationships considerably. The foundations in question place enormous emphasis on scholarly integrity. Any suggestion of academic misconduct would have proven catastrophic for our funding prospects. Alain observed how the confined space seemed to press the accumulated secrets closer together, like actors forced into an intimate scene. The stage manager's nervous adjustment of his spectacles increased in frequency, while his gaze moved repeatedly to a locked filing cabinet whose key hung from a chain around his neck. On the desk, partially concealed beneath production schedules, lay what appeared to be a botanical reference work open to detailed illustrations of foxglove species. "Mr. Crane, I understand the theatre maintains a property garden for period productions," Alain observed with characteristic courtesy. "I don't suppose foxglove grows among your historically appropriate plantings." The question produced a moment of silence that carried weight beyond mere conversational pause. Crane's spectacles required another adjustment, while Professor Blackwood's academic composure showed its first signs of genuine strain. "Naturally, Inspector," Crane replied, though his voice carried a slight tremor. "We cultivate various plants for authenticity. Foxglove is rather common in English gardens, particularly for Victorian and Edwardian productions, though one would hardly expect." He trailed off, perhaps recognizing the implications of his own words. The theatre's complex layout became apparent as Alain learned of the multiple routes to the Pemberton box. The main staircase used by patrons, a service corridor accessible to staff, and a narrow passage that connected directly to the upper circle. Each route offered opportunities for discreet movement, particularly during a performance when attention focused upon the stage. "Theatre safety requires precise knowledge of personnel movements," Crane explained, consulting his meticulously maintained charts. "However, academic symposiums present unique challenges. Distinguished guests expect certain freedoms of movement that complicate our usual protocols." The locked filing cabinet continued to draw Alan's attention, its brass fittings gleaming dully in the electric light. Whatever secrets it contained seemed to press against the confines of their metal prison, demanding acknowledgement, yet remaining tantalizingly beyond reach. Professor Blackwood's revelation about the symposium's precarious finances added another layer to the evening's complex motivations. Several major benefactors had expressed concern about potential scandal, with funding contingent upon the symposium's successful and uncontroversial execution. Dr. Ashworth's threatened exposé had placed not merely individual reputations at risk, but the financial foundation upon which the entire scholarly enterprise depended. As the interview concluded, Alain found himself reflecting upon the theatre's capacity for concealment and revelation. Every performance required precise timing, careful preparation, and the willingness to embrace whatever role circumstances demanded. The murder of Dr. Ashworth had been orchestrated with theatrical precision, timed to coincide with the dramatic reading's climactic moment when cries of distress would be mistaken for artistic appreciation. The prompt books watched from their shelves with the patient attention of witnesses who had observed decades of human drama, both scripted and improvised. In their accumulated wisdom lay the understanding that truth and performance had always been intimate companions within these walls. Somewhere among the carefully maintained records and meticulously planned schedules lay the key to understanding how Dr. Ashworth's final performance had been choreographed. The office fell silent except for the distant whisper of the theater's ancient heating system and the soft rustle of papers being nervously rearranged. Mrs. Endicott paused in the doorway, her practical wisdom suggesting words left unspoken, secrets yet to be revealed. The botanical reference remained open on the desk, its detailed illustrations of foxglove serving as silent testimony to the deadly knowledge that had transformed scholarly discourse into murder. Most foul. In the gathering quiet, Alan sensed that the evening's performance was far from concluded, and that the final act would require all his considerable skills to navigate the treacherous currents where academic ambition, theatrical tradition, and human desperation converged in deadly purpose. The manuscript room occupied a forgotten corner of the theater's upper reaches, where the building's Victorian architects had carved out a scholar's retreat from what had once been storage space. Tall windows, their mullioned glass casting geometric patterns across worn Persian carpets, provided natural light that seemed almost ecclesiastical in its quality. The walls bore floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with prompt books, theatrical memoirs, and bound volumes of dramatic criticism, their leather spines creating a palette of browns and deep reds that spoke to decades of accumulated theatrical wisdom. A single mahogany table dominated the center of the room, its surface scarred by generations of scholarly endeavor, while the air held that particular fragrance of old paper, beeswax polish, and the faint ghost of pipe tobacco that seemed to permeate all serious academic spaces. Timothy Hartwell stood beside the table with his leather portfolio spread open before him like an altar of confession, his pale hands trembling slightly as they hovered over documents that clearly weighed heavily upon his conscience. The morning light revealed details that the previous evening's shock had concealed. The careful precision of his scholarly annotations, the methodical organization that spoke to years of devoted service, and the unmistakable signs of moral conflict that had etched themselves into his youthful features. His fair hair, cut with the economical precision of academic life, caught the light as he raised his head to meet Inspector Alain's gentle regard. Dr. Ashworth's research methods were comprehensive, Inspector, Hartwell began, his voice carrying the careful modulation of one navigating treacherous conversational waters. He believed that academic truth required absolute commitment, regardless of personal consequences or professional courtesy. These documents contain evidence of systematic academic fraud, not merely plagiarism, but deliberate sabotage of rival scholars through fabricated documentation and manipulated peer reviews. Olayan observed how the young man's fingers moved protectively over a smaller folder marked Collateral Notes in Ashworth's distinctive hand. The portfolio revealed layers of deception that extended far beyond mere scholarly rivalry into realms where careers were destroyed through calculated malice disguised as academic rigor. Letters bearing university letterheads suggested institutional complicity, while private correspondence revealed the human cost of Ashworth's moral housekeeping, as he had apparently termed his systematic destruction of professional reputations. I discovered the extent of his methods 3 weeks ago, Hartwell continued, his academic training evident in the precise phrasing that sought to minimize personal culpability while acknowledging moral complexity. He had been using me to gather information, to verify citations that didn't exist, to transcribe interviews that never took place. When I confronted him, he called me an unformed conscience and suggested that preserving scholarly integrity sometimes required morally ambiguous means. The revelation cast the previous evening's tragedy in a more sinister light, suggesting that multiple individuals might have possessed compelling motives for silencing the critic whose threatened exposé could have destroyed careers built over decades of careful cultivation. Alain sealed the documents with Hartwell's signature across the flap, recognizing that they represented evidence of systematic corruption that extended far beyond the current investigation. Dame Cordelia Fairfax received them in her dressing room, that sanctuary of theatrical tradition, where mirrors reflected not merely physical appearance, but the accumulated memories of countless performances. She sat before her illuminated dressing table with the composed dignity of one accustomed to managing personal crises behind public masks, though her hands betrayed the slight tremor of age or anxiety as they rested beside a silver-framed photograph of a distinguished gentleman in military uniform. "My late husband served with distinction during the war, Inspector," she said, her trained voice maintaining its professional control, while her eyes reflected deeper currents of pain and protective love. Group Captain Sir Alistair Fairfax commanded a squadron whose operations occasionally required difficult decisions that peacetime morality might question. Dr. Ashworth had somehow obtained documentation suggesting that certain wartime actions were motivated by personal rather than strategic considerations. The threat to her carefully preserved memory of her husband's honor provided a motive that transcended mere professional preservation, touching upon the deepest sources of personal identity and public reputation. Dame Cordelia's revelation suggested that Ashworth's capacity for destruction extended beyond academic circles into the most intimate realms of family honor and posthumous legacy. Mr. Fitzwilliam emerged from the shadows of his prompt corner with the quiet authority of one who had spent decades observing theatrical life from positions of strategic invisibility. His small domain, wedged into the stage's left-hand corner, bore the accumulated wisdom of 37 years of professional observation. The prompt book lay open before him, its pages bristling with annotations and corrections, while a hooded lamp cast precise illumination across his meticulously maintained records. "Inspector, in my years at the Pembroke, I've witnessed several incidents that, while officially recorded as accidents, displayed certain consistencies that might interest a professional investigator," he said, his voice carrying the respectful deference appropriate to his position while suggesting knowledge that transcended mere theatrical routine. Sandbags that slipped at convenient moments, fire doors mysteriously blocked during safety inspections, critics indisposed after consuming theater refreshments, always when the theater faced particular difficulties, financial troubles, scandalous productions, or threatening investigations. The old prompter's revelation suggested a pattern of institutional violence that extended far beyond immediate academic rivalry, implying a systematic approach to eliminating threats that had been refined through decades of practice. His notebook contained dates and brief descriptions that, while individually insignificant, collectively painted a disturbing picture of convenient deaths that had resolved various crises threatening the theater's reputation or financial stability. The prompt book was altered between yesterday's rehearsal and the evening's performance, Fitzwilliam continued, indicating a page whose paper appeared newer than its neighbors. Someone with intimate knowledge of theatrical timing had inserted additional cues, 3 soft taps that would signal the lighting operator to hold the dramatic moment slightly longer than scripted. The revelation provided crucial evidence of premeditation, suggesting that the murder had been choreographed with theatrical precision to coincide with the reading's climactic moment when cries of distress would be mistaken for artistic appreciation. The altered prompt book represented tangible proof that someone with both theatrical knowledge and access to the production had carefully orchestrated the timing of Dr. Ashworth's death. As Alain prepared to leave the manuscript room, he observed how the afternoon light had shifted across the scholarly volumes, casting new shadows that seemed to reveal previously hidden depths. The accumulated wisdom of theatrical tradition and academic pursuit had converged in deadly purpose, creating a crime that honored both the victim's intelligence and the perpetrator's sophisticated understanding of human psychology. On the windowsill, someone had placed a single white rose, its petals beginning to brown at the edges. Whether memorial or warning remained unclear, but its presence suggested currents of emotion that extended beyond mere professional rivalry into realms where love, loyalty, and revenge intersected in combinations capable of justifying the ultimate transgression. The theater's capacity for both revelation and concealment had been employed in service of murder most carefully planned, and Inspector Allen suspected that the final act would require all his considerable skills to navigate the treacherous currents where academic ambition, theatrical tradition, and human desperation converged in deadly performance. The manager's office retained the particular atmosphere of a space where theatrical dreams and financial realities conducted their eternal negotiations. Framed lithographs of the Pembrokes' triumphant productions created a gallery of past glories above leather furniture whose rich patina spoke to decades of anxious consultations and difficult decisions. Charles Pemberton's mahogany desk bore the accumulated weight of correspondence whose diplomatic language barely concealed the brutal economics of theatrical survival, while the morning light filtering through tall windows revealed dust motes that danced like memories of vanished audiences. The air held layers of scent that told the theater's story. Furniture polish applied with religious devotion, the ghost of expensive cigars, and that indefinable fragrance of hope deferred that seemed to permeate all spaces where art and commerce intersected in uneasy partnership. Inspector Allen positioned himself near the marble mantelpiece where a small fire provided both warmth and the sort of domestic comfort that might encourage unguarded revelations. He had requested that tea be served, understanding that the ritual of pouring and stirring often proved more effective than direct interrogation in loosening carefully guarded tongues. The china bore the theater's monogram in faded gold, and the gentle percussion of spoons against porcelain provided a civilized counterpoint to the morning's darker business. Dr. Helena Voss entered with the measured confidence of one accustomed to defending intellectual territory, though Alain's trained observation detected subtle signs of strain beneath her composed facade. Her dark suit was cut with the precision that marked ambitious academics navigating established hierarchies, while her manner suggested someone perpetually aware of being observed and judged by invisible tribunals of scholarly opinion. James Whitmore followed with the diffident air of a junior colleague whose loyalty had perhaps outstripped his prudence, carrying himself with that particular tension of one whose professional future remained precariously balanced between promise and peril. Dr. Voss, Mr. Whitmore. Alain began with characteristic courtesy. I understand that Dr. Ashworth's planned presentation would have had considerable implications for current scholarly interpretations. Perhaps you might illuminate the specific nature of his proposed revelations? Dr. Voss accepted her teacup with hands that betrayed the slightest tremor, whether from the morning's chill or deeper anxieties remaining diplomatically unclear. Dr. Ashworth had been reconsidering certain aspects of my doctoral thesis that have faced considerable criticism from established scholars. She explained, her academic training evident in the careful phrasing that sought to minimize personal investment while acknowledging professional stakes. His research had uncovered documentation that supported my theoretical framework regarding collaborative authorship in detective fiction, while simultaneously exposing what he termed the questionable foundations of competing interpretations. Pemberton, who had been arranging correspondence with the nervous precision of one whose livelihood depended upon maintaining appearances, looked up from his papers with the expression of a man confronting unwelcome revelations. Inspector, if I may interject, our principal subscribers have expressed considerable concern about the symposium's potential for controversy. Academic storms may be intellectually stimulating, but they make poor box office. The manager's revelation provided crucial context for understanding the complex pressures surrounding Dr. Ashworth's threatened exposé. The letters spread across his desk, written in the diplomatic language that wealthy patrons employed when wielding financial influence, made Clear that scandal would have meant the withdrawal of support upon which both the symposium and the theatre's continued operations depended. Mr. Whitmore, Alain continued, his attention shifting to the younger scholar with the gentle insistence that marked all his interrogations. Your own research has, I understand, occasionally intersected with Dr. Voss's work. A rather fruitful intellectual partnership, one might assume? The question produced a moment of silence that carried weight beyond mere conversational pause. Whitmore's composure wavered as he glanced toward Dr. Voss with the sort of quick, nervous look that suggested shared secrets extending beyond professional collaboration. Helena and I have worked together on several projects, he admitted, his use of her first name revealing intimacies that academic protocol would normally conceal. Our methodologies complement each other in ways that enhance the quality of our individual scholarship. Dr. Ashworth had suggested that such collaboration might violate certain principles of academic independence, though he never specified the precise nature of his concerns. The revelation of their partnership, both professional and evidently personal, provided multiple layers of motive for eliminating a critic whose exposé could have destroyed their careers and their relationship simultaneously. The academic world's complex codes regarding collaboration and individual achievement created treacherous waters where even innocent cooperation might be construed as fraudulent conspiracy. If we might venture beyond these comfortable surroundings, Alain suggested with diplomatic tact, I should like to examine the theatre's property garden. I understand it provides botanically accurate specimens for period productions. They descended by way of a service corridor to the theatre's enclosed garden, where morning frost lingered upon gravel paths and the iron gate complained softly in its hinges. The space possessed that particular quality of cultivated authenticity that marked theatrical enterprises, where historical accuracy served artistic rather than purely scholarly purposes. Against the far wall, the last stems of foxglove stood with oddly dignified bearing, their stalks browned but still competent, bearing labels inked in a neat, old-fashioned hand that caught the pale sunlight. Alain moved among the plants with the careful attention he brought to all potential crime scenes, noting how the garden's layout would have provided both opportunity and concealment for someone seeking to harvest deadly materials. The potting shed revealed not only the expected tools and supplies, but also a small botanical reference work whose pages showed recent consultation of entries regarding the extraction and concentration of natural toxins. Beautiful flowers, he observed mildly, indicating the foxglove specimens, but rather dangerous if one possesses the requisite knowledge. I understand they were planted for your production of The Duchess of Malfi, a play, if memory serves, much concerned with poison and its effects. Dr. Voss's carefully maintained composure showed its first signs of genuine strain as she observed Alain's methodical examination of the garden tools. Her gloves, too fine for such surroundings, remained clutched in her hands rather than worn, while Whitmore had thrust his hands deep into his pockets with the unconscious gesture of one seeking to conceal evidence. The discovery of a small glass vial, carefully cleaned but retaining microscopic traces of plant matter, hidden among the gardening implements, suggested premeditation that extended far beyond mere opportunity. Someone with botanical knowledge and access to the theatre's resources had prepared the poison with considerable care, timing its administration to coincide with the dramatic reading's climactic moment when cries of distress would be mistaken for artistic appreciation. Mr. Whitmore, Alain said quietly, his trained gaze having detected the telltale traces of dark soil beneath the young man's fingernails. Gardening can be a most rewarding pursuit, though it does leave its marks upon the dedicated practitioner. The observation produced a moment of absolute stillness, as if the garden itself held its breath, while the implications settled like morning dew upon the carefully tended plants. Dr. Voss's academic composure finally cracked as she reached instinctively toward her companion, her movement revealing a faint greenish stain upon her glove, where the fabric had brushed against some bruised leaf. The morning light shifted across the garden's geometrical beds, casting new shadows that seemed to reveal previously hidden depths in the complex relationship between the two scholars. Somewhere within their careful phrases and diplomatic admissions lay the truth about Dr. Ashworth's death, and Elaine suspected that when revealed it would prove as dramatically satisfying as any denouement the academic world had ever witnessed. On the potting bench, a circular mark the size of a small glass remained visible in the wood's grain, while the botanical reference lay open to detailed illustrations of foxglove species and their toxic properties. The theater's capacity for both creation and destruction had been employed in service of murder most carefully orchestrated, requiring all his considerable skills to navigate the treacherous currents where intellectual ambition, personal loyalty, and institutional survival converged in deadly purpose. As they prepared to return to the theater's carpeted warmth, Elaine observed how Dr. Voss and Mr. Whitmore positioned themselves to maintain visual contact while avoiding obvious association. The unconscious choreography of conspirators whose shared secret had transformed scholarly collaboration into something far more dangerous than mere academic partnership. The garden's silent testimony would prove crucial evidence in unraveling the complex motivations that had driven two promising scholars to employ their considerable intelligence in service of murder most foul. The administrative offices of the Dorothy L. Sayers Memorial Symposium occupied a suite of rooms on the theater's quieter mezzanine, where tall windows overlooked the narrow lane that separated the Pembroke from its neighboring buildings. The morning light, filtered through net curtains yellowed by decades of London air, cast geometric patterns across Persian carpets, whose faded elegance spoke to the eternal struggle between artistic ambition and economic reality. Professor Miranda Blackwood's temporary domain bore the accumulated weight of scholarly enterprise. Correspondence files arranged with mathematical precision, symposium programs stacked in neat pyramids, and financial ledgers whose columns told stories of dreams constrained by practical limitations. The air held that particular fragrance of academic endeavor, fountain pen ink, typing ribbon, and the faint ghost of anxiety that seemed to permeate all spaces where intellectual aspirations confronted worldly necessities. Inspector Allen positioned himself near the room's writing desk, where a silver-framed photograph of Dorothy L. Sayers gazed out with the knowing expression of one who had understood the complex relationship between truth and fiction. He observed how Professor Blackwood had arranged her materials with the territorial instinct of an academic claiming intellectual space, each document positioned with the precision that marked those accustomed to defending scholarly territory against invisible but persistent challenges. Her silver hair, usually arranged with mathematical perfection, showed the first signs of disorder. A single strand that had escaped its careful coiffure, a minute detail that spoke volumes about the strain beneath her composed facade. Charles Pemberton entered with the nervous energy of a man whose livelihood depended upon maintaining appearances even in the face of potential catastrophe. His morning dress, though impeccably tailored, could not entirely conceal the weight of financial pressures that had etched themselves into his features overnight. He carried a leather portfolio whose contents, judging by his protective manner, represented either salvation or damnation for the theater's continued operations. The miniature theatrical mask that served as his paperweight caught the morning light, its painted smile seeming to mock the gravity of their circumstances. "Inspector," Pemberton began, his voice carrying the trained projection of one accustomed to addressing audiences while concealing personal desperation, "I've discovered certain irregularities in our accounts that may bear upon your investigation." Dr. Ashworth had been making inquiries about our financial arrangements, particularly regarding the symposium's funding sources. The business of theater, you understand, requires a delicate balance of art and commerce, and sometimes that balance becomes precarious. Professor Blackwood's carefully maintained composure showed its first signs of genuine strain as financial documents spread across the desk with the reluctant precision of one revealing family secrets to necessary strangers. Her hands, usually so steady when handling scholarly materials, betrayed the slightest tremor as she rearranged papers with unnecessary attention to detail. A fountain pen lay before her, its cap removed, and she toyed with it between elegant fingers in a quiet, repetitive gesture that spoke of deeper anxieties. "Vivian and I shared a long intellectual history," she explained, her academic training evident in the careful phrasing that sought to minimize personal investment while acknowledging professional stakes. "We were colleagues, collaborators, and for a time, rather more than that. He possessed a brilliant mind, Inspector, but one coupled with a certain ruthlessness that could be professionally devastating. His criticisms, while often incisive, sometimes bordered on the vindictive. He had developed a particular talent for dissecting not merely one's work, but one's entire reputation with surgical precision." The revelation of their complex personal and professional history provided crucial insight into motivations that extended far beyond mere academic rivalry. Elaine observed how her voice carried undertones that suggested relationships extending into realms where intellectual intimacy had intersected with deeper emotional territories, creating wounds that years of professional success had failed entirely to heal. "Your collaboration with Dr. Ashworth had been instrumental in establishing your early career," Elaine observed with characteristic courtesy. "Yet his subsequent reviews of your work became increasingly critical. His planned presentation would have vindicated certain theories he had previously dismissed, I understand?" "Indeed," she replied, though her voice tightened almost imperceptibly. "Prestigious appointments, Inspector, are often contingent upon one's visible contributions to the academic community. This symposium, and my role in organizing it, was of considerable importance to my future prospects. Vivian's threatened exposé could have jeopardized not only my reputation, but also negotiations with rival institutions regarding positions that would have represented the culmination of my career." Pemberton's confession followed with the mixture of shame and resignation that marked a man confronting his own weaknesses. "The theater's accounts, Inspector, are perhaps not as robust as one might wish. Certain personal expenditures, gambling debts, I confess, have created vulnerabilities that a scandal-triggered audit would have exposed. Dr. Ashworth's revelations would have necessitated precisely such an examination, with consequences that extended far beyond mere embarrassment." Mrs. Endicott appeared in the doorway with the quiet efficiency that marked all. Her movements through the theater's complex spaces, her practical dress and sensible shoes marked her as distinctly separate from the academic company. Yet her manner suggested observational skills that came from decades of managing theatrical personalities and their various crises. She carried a small cloth packet tied with string, such as dressers use for delicate items. "Inspector," she said with respectful deference, "I thought you should see what I discovered among the academic robes returned after yesterday evening's ceremony." She opened the packet upon the desk to reveal a narrow strip of black velvet braid and several minute flakes of dried silver paint, along with a small glass vial, whose surface bore microscopic traces of plant matter that caught the morning light with sinister significance. "The braid was caught on a splinter near the Pemberton box's entrance," she explained with the tranquil pride of the competent observer. "The paint flakes were on the inner rail, from last week's scene set when we freshened Sir Robert's library cornices. The vial was hidden among the formal robes. Whoever passed had brushed against still tacky paint and left these traces. It wasn't just any academic gown, you see, but one with full regalia, the sort worn by those with distinguished degrees. The movement was studied, purposeful, like someone who had every right to be there yet wished to remain unobserved. The discovery transformed speculation into tangible evidence. providing proof that someone with access to the symposium's formal attire had prepared poison with considerable premeditation while moving through the theater with theatrical precision. Professor Blackwood's reaction, a sharp intake of breath followed by careful neutral expression, suggested recognition that extended beyond mere academic curiosity. "How very interesting," she said, though her tone suggested that interesting was perhaps inadequate for such developments. Her fingers tightened around the fountain pen until her knuckles showed white against the silver instrument. Alain sealed the evidence with appropriate care, recognizing that it represented crucial pieces in understanding how the murder had been orchestrated. The academic world's complex codes regarding collaboration and individual achievement had created treacherous waters where personal relationships provided the emotional fuel necessary to transform scholarly disagreement into deadly purpose. The office fell silent except for the distant sounds of London traffic and the soft whisper of papers being nervously rearranged. On the desk, partially concealed beneath symposium correspondence, lay a typescript bearing the heading, "The Fetish of Integrity, a Reconsideration," its pages marked with annotations in Professor Blackwood's distinctive hand. The academic world's capacity for both creation and destruction had been employed in service of murder most carefully planned, yet somewhere within the accumulated evidence lay contradictions that suggested the investigation's complexities were far from resolved. As the morning light shifted across the office's scholarly accumulations, Alain found himself reflecting upon the theater's ancient wisdom regarding the relationship between performance and truth. The symposium had been conceived as a celebration of Dorothy L. Sayers' literary legacy, but it had become instead a stage upon which academic rivalry, personal betrayal, and financial desperation had combined to produce tragedy that honored neither the victim's intelligence nor the perpetrator's scholarly achievements. The director's final edit, it seemed, had been written in poison and regret, though the complete script remained tantalizingly beyond his grasp. Professor Blackwood sat rigidly upright, as if the posture of a faculty board could provide defense against the present circumstances, while Pemberton nervously adjusted his theatrical mask paperweight, its painted features seeming to mock the carefully constructed facades that were beginning to crumble under the weight of investigation. The theater's capacity for both revelation and concealment had been employed with deadly sophistication, and Alain suspected that when the final curtain fell, it would reveal a performance more complex and tragic than any the Pembroke stages had ever witnessed. The Pembroke Theatre's main auditorium possessed that particular quality of expectant silence that settles upon a stage between performances, when empty seats hold the accumulated memory of countless audiences, and the very air seems to vibrate with dramatic possibility. The afternoon light, filtering through tall windows whose mullioned glass cast geometric patterns across worn velvet and polished brass, revealed the theater's Victorian grandeur in all its faded magnificence. Inspector Allen had arranged for the space to be cleared, understanding that the reconstruction of the previous evening's events required the sort of methodical precision that theatrical professionals brought to their craft. The ghost light, that solitary sentinel of dark theaters, cast its pale illumination across the stage where Dorothy L. Sayers' words had provided the backdrop for murder most carefully orchestrated. Robert Crane waited in the wings with his production schedules spread across a prop table like sacred texts, his wire-rimmed spectacles requiring constant adjustment as he consulted the meticulously maintained records that had governed the evening's tragic choreography. His nervous energy seemed to fill the space around him, creating an atmosphere of barely contained anxiety that spoke to knowledge carefully concealed beneath professional competence. The stage manager's domain had always been one of precise timing and careful coordination, skills that could serve multiple purposes when applied with deadly intent. "Mr. Crane," Alain began with characteristic courtesy, "your production records indicate several interesting discrepancies in the evening's timeline. The dramatic reading of Gaudy Night was scheduled to conclude at 9:15, Yet your notes show it extended nearly 10 minutes beyond the planned duration. Such variations would be unusual in a carefully choreographed performance. The question produced a moment of silence that seemed to echo in the theater's vast spaces. Crane's hands moved nervously among his papers, rearranging schedules with the compulsive precision of one seeking to impose order upon increasingly chaotic circumstances. There were certain technical adjustments requested during the performance, he admitted, his voice carrying the careful modulation of one navigating treacherous conversational waters. 3 additional light cues were inserted into the prompt book between rehearsal and performance, soft taps that would signal the lighting operator to hold the dramatic moment slightly longer than scripted. The revelation provided crucial evidence of premeditation, suggesting that someone with intimate knowledge of theatrical timing had carefully orchestrated the moment of Dr. Ashworth's death to coincide with the reading's climactic scene. Alain examined the altered prompt book, noting how the interpolated cues had been marked in a hand that differed subtly from Crane's usual precise notation. The timing was everything. Digitalis required several minutes to achieve its full, fatal effect, and the killer had calculated the administration to ensure death occurred precisely when Harriet Vane discovered the crucial evidence, when cries of distress would be mistaken for artistic appreciation. A constable emerged from the property room carrying a small wrapped package, his expression suggesting discovery of considerable significance. "Inspector, we found this concealed behind a stack of false books in one of the prop cupboards. It's a second brandy glass, identical to the one found in Dr. Ashworth's box, but thoroughly cleaned, though the forensic examination may yet reveal traces." Alain examined the glass with the careful attention he brought to all potential evidence. Its very cleanliness spoke volumes, suggesting a meticulous mind that had planned not merely the administration of poison, but its concealment through the replacement of the fatal glass with an innocent substitute. The discovery narrowed the field of suspects considerably, pointing toward someone with detailed knowledge of the theater's backstage operations and access to its extensive prop collection. A tiny scratch along the stem, visible only under direct light, would provide the sort of identifying mark that could prove decisive in establishing the murderer's identity. Timothy Hartwell approached from the manuscript room with the quiet determination of one who had wrestled with conscience and found the courage to speak truth regardless of personal consequences. His leather portfolio remained clutched against his chest, though his bearing suggested that its burden of secrets had finally become too heavy for solitary carrying. "Inspector," he said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke, "I've discovered additional documentation among Dr. Ashworth's private papers that extends far beyond the current symposium. He maintained what he called his insurance files, detailed records of academic misconduct, personal scandals, and professional vulnerabilities gathered over years of scholarly research. The files that Hartwell produced painted a disturbing picture of systematic destruction that extended throughout the academic establishment. Letters bearing university letterheads suggested institutional complicity, while private correspondence revealed the human cost of Ashworth's moral housekeeping, as he had apparently termed his calculated campaign against rival scholars. The evidence suggested that multiple individuals might have possessed compelling motives for silencing a critic whose threatened exposé could have destroyed careers built over decades of careful cultivation. The reconstruction reveals a crime that honored both the victim's intelligence and the perpetrator's sophisticated understanding of theatrical timing, Alain observed, his trained gaze moving across the stage where the murder had been so carefully choreographed. Yet the emotional motivation appears to extend beyond mere professional preservation into realms where personal loyalty and protective devotion intersect in combinations capable of justifying the ultimate transgression. The theater's ancient acoustics seemed to amplify the silence that followed, as if the building itself were holding its breath while truth prepared to emerge from its carefully constructed concealment. The afternoon light shifted across the empty auditorium, casting new shadows that revealed previously hidden depths in the complex web of relationships surrounding Dr. Ashworth's death. On the prompt table, the altered production book lay open to the page bearing those 3 fateful taps, their simple notation belying the deadly precision with which they had been employed. The theater's capacity for both revelation and concealment had been employed with deadly sophistication, yet somewhere within the accumulated evidence lay contradictions that suggested the investigation's complexities were far from resolved. As Alan prepared to gather the final threads of evidence, he sensed that the ultimate revelation would prove as dramatically satisfying as any denouement the Pembroke Theatre had ever witnessed, though the truth, when revealed, would carry implications that extended far beyond the immediate circle of suspects into the very foundations of academic integrity and human loyalty. The ghost light continued its solitary vigil, casting shadows that seemed to dance with the accumulated secrets of decades, while the theater waited in patient silence for its final, most crucial performance to begin. The service passages of the Pembroke Theatre retained that particular quality of spaces untroubled by public scrutiny, where the accumulated silence of decades seemed to press against lime-washed walls like a tangible presence. These narrow corridors, stitched into the building's fabric with Victorian ingenuity, bore witness to the theatre's hidden geography, a labyrinth of practical necessity that allowed the magic of performance to proceed without revealing its mechanical secrets. Gas sconces, long since converted to electric bulbs, cast pools of amber light upon worn runners that preserved an ecclesiastical hush beneath passing feet, while the faint tang of dust, sizing, and old rope persisted like incense in some forgotten chapel dedicated to the theatrical arts. Inspector Allen followed Mr. Fitzwilliam through this warren of concealed passages, noting how the elderly prompter's small hand lamp created a halo around his white hair, while picking out the accumulated notations upon walls that told stories of decades of quick changes and emergency repairs. The air held layers of scent that spoke to the building's complex history, furniture polish applied with religious devotion, the ghost of expensive tobacco, and that indefinable fragrance of secrets carefully preserved in darkness. "It's not generally known, Inspector," Fitzwilliam said with the professional discretion that marked all his observations, that the Pemberton box once possessed a private entrance intended for the convenience of certain distinguished patrons who found the public stairs rather conspicuous. We ceased using it years ago, though the mechanism remains quite functional. He demonstrated by pressing a portion of molding near a narrow stair landing, whereupon the wall yielded with reluctant courtesy, revealing a flight of tight steps that ascended into darkness. The opening exhaled the faint scent of damp velvet and old flowers, while Alan's trained eye detected something more significant, a fresh smudge in the silver paint that had been applied too recently to have fully set, and caught upon a splinter in the concealed rail, a single thread of black academic silk. "The entrance provides direct access to the rear of the box," Fitzwilliam explained, his lamp revealing a narrow panel that opened behind the draped seating area. A person familiar with the mechanism could exchange a glass and withdraw without being observed by the audience. Most convenient if one possessed both the requisite knowledge and sufficient motivation. The discovery transformed speculation into tangible evidence, providing crucial insight into how the murder had been accomplished with such theatrical precision. Alain examined the passage with methodical care, noting chalk marks upon the lowest tread and minute scratches along the brass trim where a trailing sleeve might have brushed. Someone had not merely used this route, but had practiced the movement, rehearsing the deadly choreography with the same attention to detail that marked all successful theatrical performances. Dame Cordelia Fairfax received them in her dressing room with the composed dignity that had sustained her through 4 decades of public performance, though Alain's trained observation detected subtle signs that her legendary composure was beginning to fracture under sustained pressure. Her silver hair remained perfectly arranged, and her afternoon dress spoke of someone who understood that, even in crisis, presentation mattered as much as substance. Yet her hands, those expressive instruments that had commanded attention from countless audiences, betrayed the slightest tremor as they arranged themselves upon her dressing table, among the familiar tools of her craft. "Inspector," she began, her trained voice maintaining its professional resonance, while her eyes reflected currents of pain that decades of performance had taught her to conceal. "I fear I have not been entirely forthcoming about the nature of Vivian's investigations into matters that extend far beyond mere academic rivalry. He possessed documents that threatened to destroy not merely scholarly reputations, but the most cherished memories upon which some of us have built our understanding of honor and loyalty." The confession emerged with the controlled precision of a great actress delivering lines that carried the weight of genuine tragedy. Dr. Ashworth had threatened to publish certain wartime documents concerning her late husband, Group Captain Sir Alistair Fairfax, papers that painted a misleading picture of actions taken under impossible circumstances. The documents, while ultimately disprovable, possessed sufficient ambiguity to cast doubt upon a hero's memory and destroy the foundation upon which she had built her widowed life. "He called it historical revisionism," she continued, her voice gaining strength even as it revealed deeper currents of pain. "But it was nothing less than the systematic destruction of everything I held sacred. Alistair died believing his honor intact, and I have spent 20 years preserving that memory. Vivian would have dragged a noble reputation through the mud for the sake of his own twisted sense of intellectual superiority. Professor Blackwood joined them with the territorial confidence of one accustomed to commanding academic spaces, though her usual authoritative bearing showed signs of strain that careful grooming could not entirely conceal. Her silver hair revealed several escaped strands, while her hands moved nervously among her papers with the compulsive precision of one seeking to impose order upon increasingly chaotic circumstances. The symposium represented more than mere scholarly celebration. She admitted, her academic training evident in the diplomatic phrasing that sought to minimize personal culpability while acknowledging uncomfortable truths. "It was to be the capstone of my career, the achievement that would secure my legacy within Dorothy L. Sayre Scholarship." Vivian's planned revelations would have destroyed not merely individual reputations, but the entire intellectual framework upon which legitimate Sayre studies had been constructed. The afternoon light shifted through the dressing room's tall windows, casting new shadows that seemed to reveal previously hidden depths in the complex web of relationships surrounding Dr. Ashworth's death. Each revelation added another layer to the psychological portrait of a murder motivated not by simple greed or passion, but by the desperate need to protect the most fundamental aspects of personal identity and professional legacy. Mrs. Endicott appeared with her characteristic quiet efficiency, bearing a small wrapped package that she placed upon the dressing table with the ceremonial care appropriate to crucial evidence. "Inspector, we discovered this concealed among the academic robes returned after the evening's ceremony. The cleaning revealed traces that our initial examination had missed." The package contained a narrow strip of black velvet braid, several minute flakes of silver paint, and a small glass vial whose surface bore microscopic traces of plant matter that caught the light with sinister significance. The evidence spoke to careful preparation and intimate knowledge of both the theater's resources and the victim's habits, suggesting a perpetrator who had combined scholarly intelligence with theatrical sophistication in service of murder most carefully orchestrated. The braid was caught on a splinter near the hidden entrance. Mrs. Endicott explained with the tranquil pride of the competent observer. The paint flakes came from the fresh silver work on the symposium's display boards. Whoever passed had brushed against still tacky paint and left these traces. The vial was hidden among the formal robes. Not just any academic gown, but one with full regalia, the sort worn by those with distinguished degrees. The discovery provided tangible proof that someone with access to the symposium's formal attire had prepared poison with considerable premeditation while moving through the theater with the precision that came from intimate familiarity with its hidden geography. The killer had not merely seized opportunity, but had created it through careful planning that honored both the victim's intelligence and the perpetrator's sophisticated understanding of human psychology. As the evidence accumulated, Alain found himself reflecting upon the theater's ancient wisdom regarding the relationship between performance and truth. The Pembroke had witnessed countless dramas over its long history, but few had combined such intellectual sophistication with such tragic emotional necessity. Somewhere within the carefully maintained facades of academic respectability in theatrical tradition lay the complete truth about Dr. Ashworth's death, and he suspected that when revealed, it would prove as dramatically satisfying as any denouement these walls had ever witnessed. The dressing room fell silent except for the distant whisper of the theater's heating system and the soft rustle of papers being nervously rearranged. Dame Cordelia sat rigidly upright, as if the posture of performance could provide defense against the present circumstances, while Professor Blackwood's fountain pen remained motionless in her hand, its gold nib catching the light like an accusation waiting to be written. On the dressing table, among the familiar tools of theatrical transformation, lay the physical evidence that would soon complete the puzzle of Dr. Ashworth's murder. The theater's capacity for both revelation and concealment had been employed with deadly sophistication, and Alain knew that the final act would require all his considerable skills to navigate the treacherous currents where academic ambition, theatrical tradition, and human desperation had converged in deadly purpose. The stage was set for the ultimate revelation, and he sensed that when the final curtain fell, it would illuminate truths as complex and tragic as any the Pembroke Theatre had ever presented to its audiences. The ghost light continued its solitary vigil in the empty auditorium, casting shadows that seemed to dance with the accumulated secrets of decades, while the theatre held its breath in patient anticipation of the performance that would bring this particular drama to its inevitable, tragic conclusion. The Pembroke Theatre's grand auditorium possessed that particular quality of expectant silence that precedes the most solemn of performances, when empty seats seem to lean forward in anticipation, and the very architecture holds its breath for revelation. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows whose mullioned glass cast geometric patterns across worn velvet and polished brass, revealed the theatre's Victorian grandeur in all its faded magnificence. Inspector Allen had arranged the suspects among the red plush seats with the careful attention of a director positioning his cast for the final act, understanding that truth, like great theatre, required both proper staging and perfect timing. The ghost light cast its solitary beam across the stage where Dorothy L. Sayers' words had provided the backdrop for murder most carefully orchestrated, while the accumulated wisdom of decades seemed to press against the ornate walls like a tangible presence awaiting its moment of disclosure. Professor Miranda Blackwood occupied the central position in the front row, her silver hair arranged with the mathematical precision that had marked all her scholarly endeavors, though Alain's trained observation detected the subtle signs of strain that careful grooming could no longer entirely conceal. Her burgundy dress, chosen with the same attention to detail that characterized her academic presentations, seemed almost too perfectly appropriate for the circumstances, while her hands rested upon her leather portfolio with the protective gesture of one guarding secrets that had grown too heavy for solitary carrying. Dame Cordelia Fairfax maintained her legendary composure from a seat of honor, her bearing suggesting the accumulated dignity of 4 decades spent commanding audiences, yet her fingers betrayed the slightest tremor as they adjusted the program she held like a talisman against the approaching storm. Charles Pemberton shifted nervously in his seat, his theatrical mask paperweight catching the light as he set it down with unconscious precision. while Dr. Helena Voss and James Whitmore sat with the careful distance of those whose shared secrets had been exposed to unwelcome scrutiny. Timothy Hartwell, his young face etched with the strain of recent moral revelations, clutched his research materials with the desperate grip of one whose entire understanding of scholarly integrity had been fundamentally shaken. Robert Crane held his prompt book at parade rest, while Mrs. Endicott and Mr. Fitzwilliam positioned themselves with the unobtrusive efficiency of theatrical professionals who understood their role in the evening's final performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alain began with the courtesy that had marked all his investigations, his voice carrying naturally through the theater's excellent acoustics without resort to theatrical projection. "We gather in this temple of performance where truth and artifice have always been intimate companions to examine a crime that honored both the victim's considerable intelligence and the perpetrator's sophisticated understanding of human psychology. Dr. Vivian Ashworth died not from the natural failure of an aging heart, but from digitalis poisoning administered with theatrical precision during the dramatic reading of Gaudy Night, timed to ensure that his final moments coincided with Harriet Vane's discovery of crucial evidence. The revelation produced a silence that seemed to echo in the theater's vast spaces, broken only by the soft whisper of programs being nervously adjusted and the distant sounds of London traffic filtering through the ancient walls. Alan moved with deliberate grace to the edge of the stage, his presence commanding attention without demanding it, as he began the methodical reconstruction that would transform speculation into certainty. The poison was harvested from this very theater's property garden, where foxglove grows in abundance for period productions, he continued, his gaze moving across the assembled suspects with the patient attention of one accustomed to reading human nature in all its complexity. The extraction required considerable botanical knowledge, the sort acquired through scholarly research into historical methods of murder. Research that might legitimately be conducted by one studying the relationship between literature and toxicology. The concentrated digitalis was prepared with scientific precision and administered in Dr. Ashworth's customary brandy, delivered to the Pemberton box through passages known only to those with intimate familiarity with the theater's hidden architecture. He paused, allowing the implications to settle like dust after a curtain falls. The method required not merely opportunity and means, but the sort of protective devotion that could transform scholarly disagreement into deadly purpose. The killer possessed access to the theater's resources, detailed knowledge of Dr. Ashworth's habits, and the theatrical sophistication necessary to choreograph murder with the precision of a stage production. Alan then turned his attention to the physical evidence that had accumulated with inexorable logic. Mr. Crane's prompt book, that sacred text of theatrical production, showed a crucial alteration: 3 additional light cues inserted between rehearsal and performance. These soft taps, marked in a firm academic hand, quite different from Mr. Crane's elegant script, served to prolong the dramatic tension of the gaudy night, reading at precisely the moment when the digitalis would achieve its fatal effect. The timing was everything. The poison required several minutes to act, and the killer had calculated its administration to ensure death occurred when cries of distress would be mistaken for artistic appreciation. The inspector's trained gaze settled upon the concealed panel that Mr. Fitzwilliam had demonstrated, its brass fittings gleaming dully in the afternoon light. The Pemberton box possesses a private entrance, a narrow passage known to few but accessible to one who had surveyed the theater's facilities with scholarly thoroughness. Fresh smudges of silver paint and a thread of black academic silk, caught upon a splinter in the concealed rail, provided irrefutable proof of its recent use. The perpetrator entered during the performance, exchanged Dr. Ashworth's brandy glass for an identical substitute prepared with deadly precision, and withdrew through the hidden passage, while attention focused upon the stage. Mrs. Endicott's evidence, presented with the quiet pride of professional competence, had provided the crucial links in the chain of proof. Among the academic robes returned after the ceremony, we discovered not merely traces of paint and fabric, but a small glass vial whose surface bore microscopic evidence of foxglove preparation. The robes in question bore full regalia, the sort worn by those with distinguished degrees and the authority to move freely through academic spaces without question. Professor Blackwood's composure, maintained through decades of scholarly discipline, showed its first signs of genuine fracture as Alain's methodical reconstruction approached its inevitable conclusion. Her hands, usually so steady when handling precious manuscripts, betrayed the slightest tremor as they rearranged her materials with unnecessary precision. The motive, Alain observed, with the gentle insistence that marked all his revelations, extended far beyond mere professional preservation into realms where intellectual devotion intersects with protective love. Dr. Ashworth's planned exposé threatened not merely individual reputations, but the entire scholarly framework upon which legitimate Dorothy L. Sayers studies had been constructed. His definitive reassessment would have revealed systematic academic fraud, fabricated evidence, and manipulated peer reviews that extended throughout the scholarly establishment. The revelation would have reduced decades of serious literary criticism to rubble, destroying not merely careers, but the very foundations of intellectual discourse about one of detective fiction's greatest practitioners. The confession, when it came, emerged with the controlled precision of a great academic delivering a lecture that carried the weight of genuine tragedy. Professor Blackwood's voice maintained its professional resonance even as it revealed the complex web of intellectual devotion and personal betrayal that had driven her to employ her considerable intelligence in service of murder most carefully planned. Vivian possessed the capacity for systematic destruction that extended far beyond normal scholarly rivalry, she explained, her academic training evident in the diplomatic phrasing that sought to minimize personal culpability while acknowledging the magnitude of her actions. His insurance files contained evidence that would have corrupted the very foundations of Dorothy L. Sayers' scholarship, reducing her profound insights to the level of academic scandal. I could not permit such desecration of a legacy that had devoted my entire career to preserving and illuminating. Her method, she revealed, had required months of preparation, combining botanical knowledge acquired through research into period gardens with intimate familiarity with the theater's hidden passages gained through years of symposium planning. The digitalis had been extracted using techniques learned during her early training in manuscript preservation, concentrated with scientific precision, and administered with timing calculated to ensure death during the reading's most dramatic moment. I used the concealed entrance that I had discovered during my initial survey of the theater's facilities, she continued, her voice gaining strength even as it revealed the depths of her carefully orchestrated deception. The academic robes provided perfect camouflage, while my position as symposium organizer gave me legitimate access to all areas of the building. I replaced the poisoned glass with an identical substitute, withdrawing through the hidden passage while attention remained focused upon Dame Cordelia's magnificent performance. Dame Cordelia's reaction revealed the complex emotions of one who recognized both the tragedy of the crime and the nobility of its twisted motivation. Her theatrical training had taught her to distinguish between mere criminality and the sort of protective devotion that could drive fundamentally decent people to desperate measures, and her expression suggested both condemnation of the method and understanding of the impulse that had inspired it. The irony, Alain reflected as the confession concluded with scholarly dignity intact, is that your crime has accomplished precisely what you sought to prevent. The investigation has revealed the very corruption you wished to conceal, ensuring that Dorothy L. Sayers' legacy will be examined with the sort of rigorous skepticism that genuine intellectual integrity demands. In seeking to preserve her reputation, you have guaranteed its most thorough and potentially damaging scrutiny. The resolution brought not triumph, but a profound sense of tragic inevitability, as if the theatre itself had witnessed the playing out of some ancient drama where noble motives inevitably corrupted into deadly purpose. Professor Blackwood rose with the dignity befitting one whose crime had been born of love rather than hatred, accepting the constable's presence with the composed resignation of a scholar who had calculated all possible outcomes and found them wanting. As the small procession moved toward the auditorium's exit, the theater seemed to exhale with the particular sadness that follows the conclusion of a tragedy. The afternoon light shifted across the empty seats, casting shadows that seemed to dance with the accumulated secrets of decades, while the ghost light continued its solitary vigil over a stage that had witnessed the final performance of a scholar whose devotion to literary truth had transformed her into its most tragic betrayer. In the gathering quiet, Elaine discovered a folded sheet of paper that had fallen unnoticed from Timothy Hartwell's portfolio. It proved to be a letter in Dr. Ashworth's distinctive hand, addressed to a provincial editor, withdrawing with elaborate courtesy a forthcoming piece on certain heroic myths. The final paragraph, written in different ink, contained a note to himself. Revision required, evidence equivocal, another approach needed. The document suggested that the critics' threatened revelations might have proven less devastating than anticipated, adding a layer of tragic irony to the evening's resolution. The theater fell silent except for the soft whisper of the heating system and the distant echo of footsteps fading into the London afternoon. The Pembroke had witnessed countless dramas over its long history, but few had combined such intellectual sophistication with such profound emotional necessity. The whisper in the shadows had been silenced, but its echo would linger long in the hallowed halls where Dorothy L. Sayers' legacy would continue to inspire both devotion and scholarly inquiry, forever marked by the tragic reminder that even the noblest motives, when corrupted by desperation and fear, could lead to consequences that honored neither the victim's memory nor the perpetrator's original intentions. The ghost light burned on, casting its eternal vigil over an empty stage where truth and performance had once again proven themselves the most intimate and dangerous of companions, 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 of companions.